The rusted trawler had been sitting untouched for nearly 10 years, until a German shepherd stopped at one steel wall and refused to move. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the hull as Ethan yanked the hidden panel free. Koda stood rigid beside him, ears forward, eyes locked on the darkness beyond. Salt air rushed from the opening. Something heavy shifted inside. Ethan's flashlight trembled across the steel compartment, and then he froze. Whatever had been sealed away all these years wasn't supposed to be found. What do you think was hidden inside? The pickup died without warning. 1 second, the engine was pulling through the rain. The next, it wasn't. Ethan Walker eased the truck onto the shoulder of Highway 109 and sat motionless behind the wheel. The windshield wipers dragged across the glass with a tired squeak. Gray water streamed down the windows. Beyond the guardrail, dark pines disappeared into mist rolling off the Pacific. For a long moment, he simply listened. Rain, wind, the ticking sound of a cooling engine. Nothing else. Beside him, Koda lifted his head from the passenger seat. The German shepherd was getting older now. White fur had begun creeping around his muzzle. His ears still stood alert, but his movements had become slower over the past year. The dog watched Ethan quietly. No whining, no barking, just waiting. Ethan turned the key. The engine clicked once, then silence. He tried again. Nothing. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He knew that sound, or rather he knew what came after it. Repairs, money, problems. And he had none of the first two left. The truck had carried him nearly 400 miles from Spokane toward the Washington coast. He had been chasing rumors of seasonal work at fishing docks and lumber yards. Now it wasn't carrying him anywhere. He opened the door and stepped into the cold rain. Koda jumped down beside him. The dog immediately circled the truck once, then returned to Ethan's side. Years ago, during Ethan's second deployment in Iraq, a military working dog had done the same thing before patrols left the wire. Old habits, old memories, too many old memories. He raised the hood and stared into the engine compartment. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the hood. The engine looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Exactly the same as it had an hour ago. But something deep inside had finally given up, much like everything else in his life. By the time he closed the hood, his jacket was soaked through. He climbed back into the cab. Koda rested his chin on Ethan's knee. The gesture was so simple, it hurt. 3 years ago, Ethan had still owned a small house outside Yakima. 2 years ago, his wife Linda had still been alive. 1 year ago, there had still been savings. Medical bills had taken all three. Cancer had taken Linda. The bank had taken the house. The nightmares had taken everything else. Now there was only a truck, a dog, and whatever cash remained in his wallet. Ethan pulled it out. A $10 bill, 2 quarters, nothing more. He stared at it for several seconds, then folded it carefully and put it back. The rain eased slightly. A road sign stood 100 yards ahead. Gray Harbor 2 miles, he looked at Koda. Guess we're walking. The dog's tail thumped once against the seat. That was enough of an answer. They left the truck locked on the roadside. Everything Ethan owned fit inside one weathered backpack. Everything except Koda. The walk took nearly 40 minutes. The road wound downhill toward the coast. Fog drifted between fishing cranes and weathered warehouses. The harbor appeared slowly through the mist. Small, a little tired, like it had seen better decades, not years. Decades. Fishing boats sat tied to aging docks. Several storefronts stood empty. Paint peeled from signs. Windows were boarded over. The town looked as if it had been holding its breath for a very long time. By the time Ethan reached the edge of town, his knees ached. Koda remained close beside him, always close. A gas station sat near the harbor road. Ethan stepped beneath the awning to escape the rain. At that exact moment, a lifted diesel truck roared out of the parking lot. Its exhaust exploded like a mortar blast. The sound hit before thought. Ethan spun, body dropping instinctively, eyes searching, hands already moving toward cover. For half a second, he wasn't standing in Washington. He was back in Iraq. Dust, heat, radio chatter, contact, contact, contact. Then a wet nose touched his hand. The harbor returned. The rain returned. The gas station returned. Koda stood beside him, staring upward, waiting, steady, present. Ethan slowly exhaled. Yeah, he muttered. The dog pressed closer. The moment passed, mostly. Inside the station, a handwritten flyer hung on the community board near the door. Surplus auction today, town property liquidation, Harbor District 1. 0 p.m. Ethan studied it. The Harbor District, old equipment, maybe tools, maybe something useful, maybe nothing. Still, it was somewhere to go. And right now, somewhere was enough. An hour later, he found himself standing among 24 townspeople gathered near the waterfront. A folding table had been set up beside the docks. Old generators, broken winches, rusted crab pots, unused equipment. The auction moved slowly. People bid on small things. Nobody seemed excited. Then Ethan noticed something farther down the pier. A shape sitting alone at the end of the dock. Large, rust-streaked, silent, a steel fishing trawler. Even from a distance it looked abandoned. Rainwater ran down its weathered hull. Seagulls perched along the railings. No one stood aboard. No one even looked at it. The auctioneer shuffled his papers. And now the final item. Several people immediately lost interest. The auctioneer pointed toward the vessel. A few heads turned. The Northern Light. The name seemed to ripple through the crowd. People exchanged looks. Someone muttered something Ethan couldn't hear. The old trawler rocked gently against its lines, waiting. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Opening bid. He glanced at the paper. Then toward the boat. Then back at the crowd. $10. The harbor suddenly felt very quiet. Rain tapped softly against the dock planks. The gulls seemed louder than the crowd. The auctioneer looked up from his clipboard and waited. Nobody moved. Nobody raised a hand. Several people stared at the old trawler and then quickly looked away. A fisherman near the front folded his arms. An older woman shook her head. Someone muttered, "Let it rot." The Northern Light rocked gently at the end of the pier. 40 feet of weathered steel. Rust streaked down the hull like old tears. Its wheelhouse windows were cloudy with salt and time. The vessel looked less like a boat and more like a grave marker. The auctioneer sighed. $10, he repeated. Anybody? Ethan studied the boat. Steel hull, weathered but intact. A roof, walls, a place to sleep. Maybe not much more. But right now he didn't need much more. He reached into his pocket. His fingers touched the folded $10 bill. The last money he had. For a moment he thought about keeping it. A meal. A motel room. Gas if somehow the truck came back to life. Then he looked at Koda. The dog sat beside him, rain collecting on his thick fur, waiting, trusting. They needed shelter more than they needed $10. Ethan slowly raised his hand. I'll bid. The auctioneer blinked. Several heads turned. A few people openly stared. The fisherman near the front actually laughed, not cruelly. More like someone watching a man volunteer to step into quicksand. The auctioneer looked relieved. $10. Going once. Nobody answered. Going twice. Silence. Sold. The gavel struck the table, just like that. Ethan Walker became the owner of the Northern Light, a boat nobody wanted. The crowd immediately began drifting away. People collected their purchases. Conversations resumed. But Ethan noticed one person who wasn't leaving. A broad-shouldered man stood near a stack of lobster traps. Late 60s. Gray hair, dark rain jacket. His face had gone noticeably pale. He wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at the boat. The expression lasted only a second. Then it vanished. Years of military experience taught Ethan to notice moments like that. Moments people thought nobody saw. The man's eyes shifted, scanning, calculating. Then he turned and walked toward the harbor office. The movement felt wrong. Not because of what he did, because of what he tried not to show. The auctioneer handed Ethan a weathered envelope, paperwork's inside. Ethan opened it. Registration, ownership transfer, a ring of tarnished keys. The auctioneer hesitated. You know the story? No. The man rubbed the back of his neck. Captain Raymond Granger owned her. He nodded toward the trawler. Good fisherman, quiet man. What happened to him? The auctioneer glanced toward the harbor. The water beyond the breakwater looked dark and endless beneath the clouds. Storm came through 9 years ago. Nasty one. He went out. The man paused, never came back. Ethan waited. The auctioneer lowered his voice. They found his skiff 3 days later. Empty. No body. A cold gust swept across the harbor. Koda's ears twitched. The town says the boat's cursed, the auctioneer added. Ethan almost smiled. After Iraq, curses ranked pretty low on his list of concerns. The auctioneer pointed toward the harbor office. That fellow over there is Martin Crow, the harbor master. Ethan followed the direction. The same man who had gone pale moments earlier was unlocking the office door. Been running this harbor more than 20 years. Martin disappeared inside without looking back. Something about the man's reaction stayed with Ethan. Not fear. Not exactly. More like disappointment. As if a plan had just gone wrong. The thought lingered while Ethan and Koda walked down the dock. The northern light looked even larger up close. Steel hull, heavy rails, commercial fishing rigging hanging motionless. Years of neglect covered every surface, yet beneath the rust the bones remained solid. Ethan stepped onto the gangway. The wood creaked beneath his boots. Koda followed immediately. The dog never hesitated. Not once. The deck shifted gently beneath them. The smell hit first. Salt, diesel, old wood, rain. The scent of a life abandoned in place. Ethan walked slowly around the vessel. His military instincts activated automatically. Entry points, blind spots, escape routes, structural weaknesses. He wasn't even aware he was doing it anymore. Years of surviving had turned observation into habit. The forward deck was cluttered with old rope. The winch was rusted. The wheelhouse glass needed cleaning. But the structure itself looked surprisingly good. A steel boat could survive a long time if nobody sank it. The cabin door opened after some effort. The lock resisted before finally surrendering with a metallic click. Inside, dust coated nearly everything. A narrow galley, bench seating, storage lockers, a small table bolted to the floor. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, but dry, most importantly dry. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness, not yet, possibility. Koda wandered deeper into the cabin. His nails clicked softly across the floor. The dog investigated every corner with serious concentration. Closets, storage bins, the passage leading below deck. Then he stopped, completely. Ethan noticed immediately. Koda stood at the top of a stairwell leading toward the lower hold. His ears were forward, his body still. The posture wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was attention, pure attention. The same posture Ethan had seen years ago from military working dogs before they alerted handlers to something unusual. What is it? Koda didn't move. The dog continued staring into the darkness below. The harbor wind rattled something outside. A loose cable struck metal. Clang. Koda finally turned away. But a few minutes later he returned to the same spot. And then again. By sunset, Ethan had seen it 4 times. Every time the dog wandered the boat, he eventually came back to the stairwell, always looking downward, always listening. As darkness settled over Gray Harbor, Ethan spread his sleeping bag inside the forward berth. Rain tapped steadily against the hull. The enclosed space felt strange, almost too safe, almost. He placed his flashlight beside him before lying down. Old habits. The beam remained within reach of his hand. Koda settled near the doorway, not beside the bed, near the stairs leading below, guarding, watching. The harbor grew quiet. A buoy bell rang somewhere beyond the breakwater. The sound drifted through the fog. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he wasn't sleeping in a truck. For the first time in months, there was steel between him and the world. But just before sleep finally arrived, he opened his eyes again. Koda was standing, perfectly still, staring into the darkness below deck, again. And this time, The dog refused to look away. Ethan pushed himself up on one elbow. The berth was dark, except for a faint ribbon of moonlight slipping through a salt-stained porthole. Koda stood near the stairwell leading below deck, motionless, listening. The old trawler creaked softly around them. Water tapped against the hull. Far out in the harbor, a buoy bell rang once. Ethan watched the dog for several seconds. Then Koda slowly relaxed and lay down. Whatever had captured his attention was gone, or at least hidden again. Ethan settled back onto the mattress. Sleep came eventually, though not deeply. It never did. At some point before dawn, a loose cable slapped metal outside. His eyes snapped open instantly, heart racing, hand already reaching for the flashlight. For a brief second he was back in Iraq, inside a plywood barracks outside Mosul. Night, alarm sirens, boots hitting concrete, men grabbing rifles. Then the darkness of the berth returned. The smell of diesel replaced desert dust. The flashlight remained untouched beside him. Koda lifted his head. The dog watched Ethan quietly. No concern, just reassurance. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and glanced at his watch. 4:17 a.m. The rest of the night passed in fragments. An hour here, 20 minutes there. Nothing close to real sleep. When dawn finally arrived, gray light filled the cabin. Rain clouds still hung low over Gray Harbor. The town looked damp and sleepy. Ethan stepped onto the deck with a cup of instant coffee made from supplies left behind in a cabinet. The brew tasted terrible. It was wonderful. For the first time in months, he wasn't drinking it from a gas station parking lot. Koda stretched beside him. The harbor slowly woke around them. Fishing crews moved along distant docks. Engines coughed to life. Seagulls circled overhead. Life, normal life. Something Ethan had spent years watching from the outside. After finishing his coffee, he started working. The Northern Light had survived nearly a decade abandoned. Now it needed someone willing to fight for it, and Ethan understood stubborn survival better than most. By mid-morning, he had cleared 3 garbage bags of debris from the deck. Old rope, broken buckets, bird nests, rotting cardboard. Every piece removed revealed a little more of the vessel hidden underneath. The steel beneath the rust remained surprisingly solid. Whoever Raymond Granger had been, he had taken care of his boat. Koda followed Ethan everywhere. Occasionally, the dog would disappear below deck. A few minutes later, he would return, then disappear again. Always toward the lower hold, always the same direction. Near noon, Ethan found a toolbox in one of the storage lockers. The tools were old but usable. Screwdrivers, pliers, a multimeter, a rusted socket set. Enough to start bringing systems back to life. He spent the next 2 hours tracing electrical lines through the cabin. Most of the wiring looked neglected but functional. Several fuses needed replacement. A few connections required cleaning, nothing catastrophic. The realization felt oddly satisfying, like finding a wounded animal still breathing. The boat wasn't dead, just forgotten. By late afternoon, hunger finally drove him ashore. A small diner stood across from the harbor. Its sign read, Maggie's Dockside Cafe. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows. Inside, the smell nearly stopped Ethan in his tracks. Coffee, soup, fresh bread. The scents wrapped around him like a memory from another life. Koda stayed close as Ethan found a booth near the back. A woman in her 60s approached carrying a menu. Silver hair, kind eyes. The kind of face that looked permanently familiar. "You new in town?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Just got here." The woman glanced toward the harbor. "The fellow who bought the Northern Light?" Word traveled fast in small towns. "That's me." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Margaret Collins." She pointed toward the kitchen. "Most folks call me Maggie." "Ethan, Koda." Maggie crouched and scratched behind the dog's ears. Koda immediately approved. That alone told Ethan plenty. Dogs were usually right about people. "You look hungry," Maggie said. Ethan glanced at the menu. His wallet suddenly felt very empty. Maggie noticed. She didn't comment. Instead, she smiled. "We made too much clam chowder this morning." The statement was delivered with suspicious timing. "It'll just get thrown out." Ethan recognized kindness when he saw it, the same way soldiers recognized cover when bullets started flying, without discussion, without embarrassment, just acceptance. "I'd hate to see good food wasted." Maggie's smile widened. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming bowl and thick slices of bread. The chowder was hot, rich, real food, the kind that made a man realize how long he'd been surviving instead of living. For several minutes, Ethan simply ate. Across from him, Koda worked steadily through a bowl Maggie had quietly provided. The dog looked happier than he had in weeks. When Maggie returned with a coffee refill, her gaze drifted toward the harbor outside. "The old boat treating you okay?" "So far." She nodded slowly. Then her expression changed. Not quite sadness, something close. "I knew Raymond." Ethan looked up. "Captain Granger? Since I was a teenager." She stared out the window. "He used to sit right where you're sitting. Every morning. Same booth, same coffee, for years." "What happened to him?" Maggie was quiet for a moment. "No one knows." The answer felt rehearsed, used many times before, yet somehow unfinished. Before Ethan could ask another question, a customer called from across the room. Maggie excused herself, but not before leaving a paper bag beside his coffee cup. "Take that with you." "What's in it?" "Dinner." "I can't." "Sure you can." Then she walked away. No debate, no pity, just kindness. That evening, Ethan returned to the Northern Light carrying the bag. The harbor lights reflected across black water. The boat felt different now, less like shelter, more like home, a temporary one, maybe, but home nonetheless. He climbed aboard. Koda immediately trotted toward the lower hold. The dog disappeared down the stairs. A few seconds later, Ethan heard scratching, not frantic, not random, deliberate, steady. He followed the sound, descending slowly into the dim lower compartment. The beam of his flashlight swept across rusted frames and storage bins. Then he saw Koda. The dog stood beside a steel wall, pawing the same section over and over. When Ethan knocked on the metal nearby, it rang loudly, solid, normal. Then he knocked where Koda had been scratching. The sound was different, subtle, but different. Ethan frowned and knocked again. The sound came back different, not hollow, not exactly, just wrong. The steel around it produced the sharp metallic ring he expected from the hull of an old fishing trawler. This section didn't. The vibration died too quickly, as though something behind the wall was absorbing it. Koda immediately pawed the metal again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The flashlight beam trembled slightly across the steel. Not because Ethan was nervous, because he suddenly felt awake, very awake. The same feeling he used to get when something didn't belong. A disturbed patch of dirt beside a road. A window that should have been closed. A shadow where no shadow belonged. In Iraq, ignoring those details could get people killed. He crouched lower. The wall looked ordinary at first glance. Rust, paint, years of neglect. But once he started studying it, differences began appearing. Tiny differences. The seams around this section were cleaner, straighter. The welds didn't match the surrounding steel. Someone had worked on this area after the boat had been built, a lot later. Koda sat beside him and watched, waiting. Ethan ran his fingertips along the lower edge. Something flaked away. Not rust, not paint. Sealant. His pulse slowed. That always happened when he concentrated. The world narrowed. Details sharpened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small inspection mirror he'd found in Raymond's toolbox earlier that morning. The mirror still had grease stains on its handle. He angled it behind a support beam and shined his flashlight onto the reflection. The narrow gap revealed more of the seam. Fresh enough to be different, old enough to be forgotten. Someone had intentionally hidden this section. The realization settled over him slowly. The harbor outside faded away. The gulls, the wind, the distant engines, all of it disappeared. There was only the wall and the question behind it. Why? Koda stood again. The dog pressed his nose directly against the steel, then looked back at Ethan. The look was almost impatient. Ethan chuckled softly. Yeah, I see it too. The next morning he returned with tools. The harbor was wrapped in fog. Fishing boats moved through the mist like ghosts. Maggie's paper bag sat unopened on the galley counter. Coffee steamed beside it. But Ethan's attention remained fixed on the lower hold. Koda practically dragged him downstairs. The dog clearly had priorities. The first layer came off easily. Old paint, then sealant, then more sealant beneath that. Whoever had done the work wanted moisture kept out. That meant whatever lay behind the wall mattered. Hours passed. The steel surrendered slowly. By noon, Ethan had exposed the outline of a rectangular panel. 3 feet wide, 2 feet high, perfectly hidden inside the structure of the hull. His hands were dirty. His back ached. The muscles in his shoulders burned, but he kept working. By early afternoon, the final edge loosened. The panel shifted, only slightly, but enough. Koda immediately stepped closer, tail rigid, ears forward, watching, waiting. Ethan inserted a pry bar. The steel groaned. A deep sound echoed through the hull. Then the panel moved. Dust drifted into the flashlight beam. The opening widened. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. The dark cavity beyond seemed to stare back. Ethan carefully pulled the panel free. The metal was heavier than expected. He lowered it onto the deck, then aimed his flashlight into the hidden compartment. Something sat inside. Large, dark green, rectangular, military. Ethan froze. The shape was instantly familiar. He had seen dozens of them overseas, waterproof equipment cases, built to survive floods, fire, transport, war. His heartbeat quickened. The case looked untouched. No rust, no water damage, no decay. Someone had protected it carefully, very carefully. Koda whined softly. Not fear, curiosity. Ethan reached into the compartment. The case was heavy, much heavier than empty storage. He pulled, muscles straining. Eventually it slid free and landed on the deck with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the hold. Dust swirled around them. The case had 2 brass latches and a combination lock. Locked. Still locked after all these years. Ethan sat beside it. The silence felt enormous. Above them, the northern light creaked gently against her mooring lines. Outside, the harbor continued living its ordinary life. Nobody knew what sat hidden inside this boat. Nobody except Ethan and Koda. The dog immediately sniffed around the case, then sat beside it, as if guarding it. Ethan examined the lock. 3 numbers, simple. Old-fashioned, no labels, no clues, at least none that were obvious. He leaned back against the hull, thinking. If Raymond Granger had hidden this intentionally, he would have wanted someone to find it. Eventually, maybe. The old captain had gone to tremendous effort concealing the compartment, but not destroying access. That mattered. Koda suddenly stood. The dog walked toward the steel panel Ethan had removed. He sniffed it once, then pawed at the backside. Ethan frowned again. Koda scratched harder. The metal shifted slightly. Something caught the flashlight beam. A mark, tiny, barely visible. Ethan lifted the panel and turned it over. 3 numbers had been scratched into the steel. Small enough to miss, clear enough to read. For several seconds, he simply stared. The harbor seemed to stop moving. Not random, not accidental. Deliberate. His eyes drifted toward the locked case, then back to the numbers, then back again. Koda sat beside him, watching, waiting, almost as if he already knew. Slowly, Ethan reached for the combination lock. His fingers settled on the first dial, 7 the second, 1 the third, 4 the lock clicked, a sharp metallic sound inside the silent hold. Neither Ethan nor Koda moved. The lid remained closed, but no longer locked. Whatever Captain Raymond Granger had hidden nearly 10 years ago was finally within reach. And for the first time since arriving in Gray Harbor, Ethan had the unmistakable feeling that buying the Northern Light for $10 had never been an accident. It had been the beginning of something. something that had been waiting a very long time to be found. He placed one hand on the lid, then slowly lifted it open. The hinges moved with surprising ease. Whoever had sealed the case had prepared for time. The lid opened fully. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared. Inside, everything was wrapped in layers of plastic, carefully, methodically. Nothing looked rushed. Nothing looked accidental. The first thing he noticed was a stack of leather-bound journals, 3 of them. Their covers were worn smooth by years of handling. Beneath the journals sat several thick envelopes, photographs, documents, bank records, and resting on top of everything else was a single white envelope. Its paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in neat block letters, were 6 words. To the person who found this, the hold suddenly felt smaller. The beam from Ethan's flashlight illuminated floating dust particles drifting through the air. Koda sat beside him, alert, silent, watching the darkness around them, watching Ethan, watching the boat itself, as if standing guard over whatever had been hidden all these years. Ethan carefully picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile. His fingers hesitated for a moment. Then he opened it. Inside was a folded letter, several pages long, written by hand. The handwriting was steady, disciplined. The writing of someone who planned before speaking, someone who measured words carefully. Ethan unfolded the first page. The date at the top immediately caught his attention. 9 years earlier, several days before Raymond Granger disappeared. He began reading. "If you're reading this, I never made it home." The words seemed to settle into the steel walls around him. Ethan continued, "My name is Raymond Granger. I own this vessel, or perhaps owned it. If you found this case, then the Northern Light has survived longer than I did." Outside, somewhere beyond the hull, a gull cried. The sound echoed faintly through the harbor. Ethan kept reading. "For nearly 3 years I have been collecting records, documents, photographs, financial reports, evidence." His eyes moved faster now. "There are people in Gray Harbor who have stolen from this town for a very long time. People who believed nobody was paying attention. They were wrong." A cold sensation crawled across the back of Ethan's neck. Not fear, recognition. He knew what it felt like when someone wrote under pressure. He had seen similar letters overseas. Messages written by soldiers before dangerous missions. Words chosen because time might run out. Raymond's letter carried that same weight, the same certainty, the same acceptance. "I made a mistake." The next line stood alone. Ethan frowned, then continued. "I told them I knew. I thought doing the right thing would be enough. I thought the truth would protect me. I was wrong." The flashlight beam remained steady in his hand. But his attention sharpened. Every instinct told him this was becoming much bigger than an abandoned fishing boat. Raymond described meetings, threats, warnings, conversations that ended with doors closing and voices dropping. Nothing specific, not yet, just enough to establish one thing. Someone wanted him silent, very badly. Ethan reached the final page. The last paragraphs were shorter, written with less space between lines, as though Raymond had been racing the clock. "If something happens to me, everything you need is inside this case. Every name, every dollar, every record." Ethan's eyes moved to the final section, then stopped. "The man responsible is still in Gray Harbor." Silence filled the hold. Complete silence. Even Koda seemed frozen. Ethan read the sentence again. Then a third time. "The man responsible is still in Gray Harbor. No name. Not yet. Just a promise. A warning left behind for whoever found the truth." He slowly lowered the letter. The old trawler creaked around him. The sound felt different now, as though the boat itself had been waiting for someone to finally open the case, waiting for someone to finally listen. Koda suddenly stood, his ears turned toward the hatch above. Ethan immediately looked up. Years of military training made the movement automatic. Listen first, move second. The dog remained still for several seconds, then relaxed. Probably a gull on the deck, or a loose rope striking metal. Nothing more. Still, Ethan noticed how quickly Koda had reacted. The dog seemed determined not to let his guard down. Not today. Ethan returned his attention to the case. The journals waited beneath the letter. 3 decades of a man's life compressed into worn leather covers. He picked up the first one. The edges of the pages were darkened by years of use. A small label inside read, 1989, the earliest volume. He opened it carefully. The first pages contained fishing logs, weather notes, catch records, maintenance expenses, normal entries, the ordinary life of a commercial fisherman. Then he turned another page, and another. Something changed. A short note written near the bottom of a page. Paid the Miller family's electric bill today. Told the company not to mention my name. Ethan blinked. He read it again, then continued. A few pages later, sent money to help Tom Jenkins after his surgery. Another, covered school supplies for the Alvarez children. Another, mortgage payment delivered anonymously. And another, and another, and another. The entries stretched across years, hundreds of them, maybe more. Small acts, quiet acts, invisible acts. Raymond Granger had been helping people for decades. Not publicly, not for recognition, not for praise. No one had known. The realization settled slowly. Outside, evening shadows had begun gathering over Gray Harbor. The hold grew darker, but Ethan barely noticed. He kept turning pages. The more he read, the harder it became to stop. By the time darkness fully arrived, one thing had become clear. The missing fisherman the town barely talked about wasn't the man people thought he was. Raymond Granger had spent 30 years holding struggling families together. And somehow, nobody knew. Koda suddenly rose from beside him. The dog walked toward the open case, then sniffed along the interior wall. Once, twice, then again. Ethan looked up. Something in the dog's behavior felt familiar. The same focus, the same determination. The same look he had worn before finding the hidden compartment. Koda pressed his nose against the inside edge of the case, then pawed at it. A dull thump echoed through the hold. Ethan slowly leaned closer. There, hidden behind a removable lining inside the military case, was a seam, small, nearly invisible, a second compartment, and Koda had found it. Ethan stared at the nearly invisible seam running along the inside wall of the military case. The lining looked permanent, factory installed, yet now that he knew where to look, he could see tiny differences. A hidden latch, a slight gap, something Raymond Granger had never intended casual eyes to find. Koda sat beside the case, his tail swept the floor once, slowly, patiently, almost satisfied. Ethan shook his head. You keep earning your food, buddy. The German shepherd blinked, then rested his chin on Ethan's knee. The hold had grown cold. Night pressed against the hull outside. The harbor lights shimmered through the hatch above in broken reflections. Ethan carefully worked a screwdriver beneath the edge of the lining. A soft click followed. The panel loosened. Inside was a narrow storage channel. Not documents, not money, just a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Ethan unwrapped it. A stack of photographs slid into his hand. Old photographs. Dozens of them, families, children, couples, graduation pictures, hospital rooms, birthday parties, ordinary moments. At first, none of it made sense. Then he noticed something. Each photograph had writing on the back. Names, dates, amounts. Sometimes only a sentence, sometimes more. He picked up the first one. A young family standing in front of a small house. 3 children smiling into the camera. The handwriting read, "The Henderson mortgage. Paid 6 months after the mill closure. Never told them." Another. A teenage girl in a graduation gown. First semester tuition covered. Anonymous. Another. An elderly man sitting in a wheelchair. Medical equipment delivered. Family thought insurance paid. Ethan sat very still. The photographs continued, one after another. Proof, not of crimes, proof of kindness. Quiet acts hidden for decades. He looked back toward the journals. The entries he had already read suddenly felt larger, more real, because now he could see the faces, the people, the lives. A gust of wind struck the hull. The northern light groaned softly. Ethan reached for the second journal. The entries stretched through years, then decades. The pattern never changed. Whenever someone in Gray Harbor struggled, Raymond found a way to help. Sometimes it was $50, sometimes hundreds, occasionally more. Always anonymous, always secret, always without recognition. Page after page, year after year. A widow whose husband died at sea. A family facing foreclosure. A young man trying to attend trade school. A fisherman recovering from surgery. The names changed. The need changed. Raymond never did. Ethan turned another page, then stopped. His eyes remained fixed on a single entry. For a long time. The journal entry was dated 2006, several years after Ethan's second deployment. The handwriting was unchanged, neat, simple, direct. Met a Marine today at the VA clinic in Tacoma. Lost his right leg in Fallujah, struggling. Covered 3 months of rent through the housing program. Told them not to mention my name. Ethan stared at the words. Fallujah. The name alone brought images rushing back. Dust-covered roads, convoys, heat shimmering over broken concrete, the smell of diesel and burned metal. The memories arrived the way they always did. Without permission, without warning. For a moment he wasn't sitting inside a fishing boat. He was standing beside a Humvee beneath the white Iraqi sky, young, exhausted, listening to distant gunfire. Then a warm nose pressed against his wrist. The flashback broke instantly. Koda, again, always Koda. The dog remained beside him, silent, steady, present. Ethan looked down and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. His hand lingered there longer than usual. Then he returned to the journal. The Marine's entry wasn't unique. More followed, veterans, widows, disabled workers, families. Entire lives quietly held together by one fisherman. Nobody seemed to notice. Near midnight, Ethan climbed out of the hold. The harbor had gone silent. Only the sound of water moving against pilings remained. Fog drifted across Gray Harbor, soft and silver beneath the dock lights. He walked onto the deck. Koda followed. The cold air felt good after hours below. The town looked peaceful, too peaceful to contain the stories hidden inside those journals. 30 years of helping people. 30 years of carrying burdens nobody knew existed. And somehow Raymond Granger had vanished almost without a trace. The thought bothered Ethan, not because it was unfair. Life had never been fair. What bothered him was how invisible the man had become. A man could spend decades helping others and still disappear. As though he had never been there. The next morning, Ethan carried one of the journals to Maggie's diner. The breakfast crowd filled most of the booths. Fishermen, dock workers, retirees, people who looked like they had known each other forever. Maggie spotted him immediately. "And how's my favorite boat owner?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Only boat owner you've got. Still counts." She poured coffee before he even sat down. Koda settled beside the booth, already receiving attention from half the room. Ethan opened the journal. Maggie's eyes drifted toward it. "What've you got there?" "Raymond's." The smile faded from her face. Not completely, just enough. She wiped her hands on a towel, then slid into the opposite side of the booth. Ethan opened to one of the entries, the one mentioning a family whose electric service had nearly been disconnected. Maggie read silently, then read it again. Her expression changed. "You've got more of these?" 3 journals. She stared out the window. The harbor beyond looked gray beneath the morning clouds. That family was real. What family? The Turners. Her voice softened. They nearly lost everything after the father got hurt. She looked back at the page. "We always thought the church helped them." Ethan remained quiet. Maggie took a slow breath, then another. There were stories like that all over town. She shook her head. No one ever knew where the help came from. Her eyes drifted back to the journal. It was him. Ethan nodded. It was him. For several seconds, neither spoke. The diner noise faded into the background. Coffee cups, silverware, conversations, all distant. Finally, Maggie smiled sadly. That stubborn old man. Ethan closed the journal. As he did, something slid from between two pages. A folded sheet of paper, one he hadn't seen before. It landed on the table. Both Ethan and Maggie looked down. The page contained a short handwritten note. Only a few lines, but the final sentence immediately froze the air around them. I've begun keeping the financial records separately. If anything happens to me, they will expose the truth. Ethan looked up. Maggie's expression had gone completely still. The warmth had vanished from her eyes. Not fear, recognition, deep recognition. She knew something, maybe more than she wanted to. Outside the diner window, across the harbor, the door of the harbor office opened. Martin Crow stepped outside, and for the first time since arriving in Gray Harbor, Ethan had the unmistakable feeling that someone else might already know he had found Raymond, Granger's secrets. The harbor master paused on the sidewalk outside his office, a coffee cup in one hand. The harbor spread behind him, fishing boats, docks, fog drifting over dark water, an ordinary morning. Yet Ethan noticed something. Martin wasn't looking at the boats. He wasn't looking at the fisherman. His eyes were fixed on the northern light. The old trawler sat quietly at slip 14, a rusted silhouette against the harbor. Martin stared for several seconds, then disappeared back inside. Maggie watched through the diner window. Her expression remained unreadable. Finally, she spoke. Raymond stopped trusting people near the end. Ethan turned toward her. What happened? Maggie folded the towel in her hands, then unfolded it. A nervous habit. He never told me everything. But he knew something was wrong. With who? She hesitated. A long hesitation. Then she looked toward the harbor office. That answer was enough. Ethan didn't push further. Not yet. That afternoon he returned to the northern light. Rain clouds gathered offshore. The wind carried the smell of salt and diesel through the harbor. Koda immediately followed him below deck, back to the hidden case, back to Raymond's journals. Ethan spent hours reading, page after page, year after year. The first journal told the story of a man helping his community. The second journal told a different story. The tone changed immediately. The entries became shorter, more precise, more cautious. Names appeared, dates, financial records, questions. The first suspicious entry was nearly 10 years old. Harbor maintenance budget increased by $18,000. Repairs never completed. A few pages later, reviewed town records. Numbers don't match. Then another, and another, and another. A pattern emerged. Raymond had begun tracking money. Not his own money, town money, relief funds, maintenance budgets, construction projects, government grants. The entries became increasingly detailed. Photocopies, receipts, contract numbers, photographs. Every page strengthened the same conclusion. Someone was stealing systematically. For years, Koda remained beside Ethan while he read. Occasionally the dog lifted his head toward sounds outside, then relaxed again, always alert, always watching. Near sunset, Ethan opened one of the large envelopes from the case. Dozens of financial documents spilled across the table. Bank statements, invoices, construction contracts, canceled checks. His military training wasn't accounting, but patterns were patterns, and this pattern was obvious. The same name appeared repeatedly. Martin Crow, again and again and again. Payments authorized by Martin. Contracts approved by Martin. Emergency repair funds signed off by Martin. Money disappearing after Martin's approval. The realization settled heavily inside the cabin. Ethan leaned back. The old chair creaked beneath him. So this was it. This was what Raymond had died trying to expose. Not rumors, not suspicions, evidence, years of evidence, enough evidence to destroy a career. Maybe more. The final journal waited on the table. The newest one. The one written shortly before Raymond vanished. Ethan opened it. The first pages confirmed everything. Raymond had confronted Martin, directly, face to face. One entry described a meeting inside the harbor office. Another described threats, subtle at first, then less subtle. The handwriting changed as the entries progressed. Not sloppy, urgent. The words pressed harder into the paper. A man running out of time. Then Ethan reached an entry dated 3 days before Raymond disappeared. He read it twice, then a third time. Martin knows I have copies. He offered money. I refused. A cold silence filled the cabin. Outside, rain began striking the windows, soft at first, then harder. Koda lifted his head. The dog sensed Ethan's focus and remained quiet. The next page contained another entry. Short. Only 2 sentences, yet somehow worse. If anything happens to me, Helen must know. She knows where to begin looking, Helen. The name appeared several more times. Helen Granger, Raymond's sister. Ethan closed the journal. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too crowded with ghosts. He needed answers from someone still alive. The following morning he found Helen's address inside one of the envelopes. A small house near the edge of town, past the marina, past the post office, near the cliffs overlooking the Pacific. The walk took 20 minutes. Koda stayed beside him the entire way. The sky hung low and gray. Rain threatened again. The house was modest, white paint peeling from the siding, flower pots on the porch, a weathered mailbox. The name Granger painted neatly on the side. Ethan knocked, no answer. He waited, then knocked again. Footsteps approached slowly. The door opened. An older woman stood before him. Late 60s, silver hair, sharp eyes, tired eyes. The moment she saw the journal under Ethan's arm, everything changed. The color drained from her face. Not fear, recognition. The kind that arrives after years of waiting. Her eyes fixed on the worn leather cover, then lifted toward Ethan. "You bought the boat." It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She looked past him, toward Koda, toward the road, then back to the journal. For several seconds she said nothing, then stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Family photographs lined the walls. One immediately caught Ethan's attention. A younger Raymond Granger stood beside the northern light, smiling. Much younger, very much alive. Helen noticed him looking. He loved that boat more than almost anything. Her voice softened. "Sometimes I think he loved it more than himself." They sat at a small kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Ethan placed the journal in front of her. Helen touched it carefully, almost reverently. Like something fragile. Like something sacred. "He called me." The words came suddenly, without prompting, 3 hours before he disappeared. Ethan remained silent. Helen stared at the journal. He sounded tired. "He told me he had found proof. He said there were people who would do anything to keep it buried." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Then she looked directly at Ethan. The years of uncertainty showed in her eyes. Years of unanswered questions, years of grief, years of anger. He said one more thing. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Koda lifted his head. Helen swallowed, then spoke quietly. "If anything happens to me," her voice faltered. Only for a moment, then continued. "Find the boat." Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that changes everything. Because suddenly, Raymond's hidden compartment wasn't just a precaution. It had been a message. A final breadcrumb. A trail left behind by a man who knew exactly what might happen next. And for the first time, Ethan realized Raymond Granger had never expected to come back. The realization followed him all the way back to the harbor. Rain drifted across Gray Harbor in thin gray sheets. The ocean beyond the breakwater was restless. Whitecaps rolled beneath a dark sky. Koda walked close beside him. The German shepherd occasionally glanced over his shoulder, watching, checking. The same behavior Ethan remembered from military patrol dogs overseas. The dog had been doing it more often lately, as if he sensed something changing, something closing in. When the northern light finally came into view, Ethan stopped. A man was standing on the dock beside the boat. Martin Crow. The harbor master turned as Ethan approached. His smile appeared instantly, too quickly, like it had been prepared in advance. "Ethan." The older man spread his hands casually. "Hope I'm not bothering you." Ethan said nothing. Martin glanced toward the trawler. "She's looking better. I've been working on her. I can see that." The smile remained, polite, controlled. But his eyes never stopped moving. The wheelhouse, the deck, the cabin door, the boat itself, measuring, assessing. Ethan recognized the behavior immediately. People looked at things that way when they wanted something, or feared something. Martin folded his hands. "I've been thinking about the auction." "Yeah?" "The town probably should have handled that boat differently." Ethan waited. "The Northern Light means a lot to Gray Harbor." Martin paused. "I'd like to buy her." There it was. Direct, simple, unexpected. Ethan studied him carefully. "Why?" Martin shrugged. "Sentimental reasons." Neither man believed that answer. The silence stretched. Finally, Martin spoke again. "I can offer $20,000. The number landed between them. 20,000. For a rust-covered boat purchased for 10. Even the gulls seemed quieter. Ethan looked toward the harbor, then back at Martin. "No." The answer came immediately. Martin's smile held, barely. "I don't think you understand." "I understand." "No." The smile faded slightly. "I don't think you do." He stepped closer. "Not threatening. Not quite. You're a veteran. You've had some hard years." The words were soft, almost sympathetic, which somehow made them worse. $20,000 changes a lot of things. It doesn't change this. Martin's jaw tightened, only for a moment. Then the smile returned. Artificial, polished. "I'll leave the offer open." He turned and walked away. But not before glancing at the boat one last time. A long glance. The kind a man gives something he believes should belong to him. That night Ethan sat alone in the cabin. The journals lay spread across the table. Koda slept nearby, or appeared to. The dog never truly slept anymore. Not deeply, not since they'd opened the hidden compartment. Outside, rain hammered the harbor. The old trawler rocked gently against her mooring lines. Ethan until nearly midnight. More records, more evidence, more proof. Enough to destroy Martin Crow. Enough to explain why Raymond had vanished. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Then came the knock. 3 sharp impacts. Boom, boom, boom. Not on the cabin door, on the hull outside. Koda exploded upright instantly. No confusion, no hesitation. A low growl emerged from deep in his throat. Ethan's body reacted before thought. Years of training returned automatically. The flashlight disappeared. Cabin lights off. Darkness. His breathing slowed. His ears took over. Another sound. Footsteps. Someone moving on the deck. Not one person. 2, maybe 3. Koda moved toward the door, silent, focused, every muscle tight. Ethan carefully retrieved a heavy wrench from beside the engine hatch. Not because he wanted a confrontation. Because preparation kept people alive. That lesson never left. The footsteps moved again. Closer. A shadow passed across the cabin window. Then another. The visitors weren't fishermen. Fishermen announced themselves. These men were trying not to. Koda's growl deepened. The dog positioned himself between Ethan and the doorway. Protective. Ready. The cabin door handle moved once, twice, then stopped. Several long seconds passed. The rain battered the roof. Water drummed against steel. The footsteps shifted again, a whisper, too quiet to understand. Then came movement, fast movement, toward the stern, toward the rear deck. Ethan cracked the door open, just enough. Dark figures moved through the rain, 3 of them, hooded, faces hidden, heading toward the lower hold access, toward Raymond's secrets. The realization hit instantly. They weren't stealing tools. They weren't stealing fuel. They knew exactly what they wanted. Ethan stepped onto the deck, staying near the wheelhouse wall, using shadows, using angles, the same instincts that once kept him alive during night patrols. Koda moved ahead, silent, a ghost wrapped in wet black fur. One of the figures reached the hatch, then froze. The man hadn't seen Koda. Not yet. The German shepherd erupted from darkness. A violent bark shattered the night. The figure stumbled backward. Another cursed. The third immediately turned to run. Chaos exploded across the deck. Boots slipping, rain shouting, metal clanging beneath feet. Koda lunged toward the nearest intruder. The man swung something. A metal object flashed. The impact came too fast to stop. A sharp yelp cut through the storm. Ethan's stomach dropped. Koda, the dog, stumbled, then immediately recovered. Still advancing, still protecting. The intruders panicked. They fled down the gangway. One nearly fell into the harbor. Within seconds, they vanished into the darkness beyond the docks. Gone. Only Rain remained. Rain and Koda. The German shepherd stood trembling near the hatch. Water streamed from his coat. One front leg slightly lifted. Blood mixed with rainwater on the deck. Not much, but enough. Ethan crossed the distance instantly, kneeling, hands shaking, not from fear, not from adrenaline. Something deeper, something older. The same helpless feeling he'd experienced beside hospital beds, beside Linda, beside people he couldn't save. Koda pressed his nose against Ethan's shoulder, trying to reassure him. Even now, even hurt, the dog was still worried about his human. Ethan swallowed hard. "It's okay, buddy." But his voice sounded different. The blood on Koda's shoulder kept spreading through the wet fur, and for the first time since arriving in Gray Harbor, Ethan understood something terrifying. Whoever wanted Raymond's secrets buried was no longer watching from a distance. They had started making moves, and Koda had just paid the price. Rain continued falling across the harbor. The deck lights reflected off wet steel. Blood mixed with rainwater and ran toward the scuppers. Ethan's hands moved automatically. Pressure first. Assess the wound. Control the bleeding. Years of emergency training resurfaced without effort. The injury was on Koda's shoulder, a deep cut. Not life-threatening, but serious enough. The metal object one of the intruders had swung had caught him cleanly. Koda flinched once, then sat perfectly still, trusting Ethan completely. That trust hurt more than the injury itself. "Stay with me, buddy." The dog pressed against him, tail thumping weakly, still trying to reassure him, still trying to do his job. Ethan swallowed hard. The harbor suddenly felt very quiet, too quiet. An hour later, they were at the only veterinary clinic within 30 miles. The building sat near the highway outside town, a single-story structure surrounded by dripping cedar trees. The veterinarian was a woman named Dr. Melissa Hart. She examined Koda carefully. The German shepherd never growled, never resisted, even while she cleaned the wound, even while she prepared the stitches, 21 stitches. Ethan counted everyone. He sat beside the examination table the entire time, never looking away. The smell of antiseptic filled the room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. For a moment, the sounds blended together. The clinic disappeared. The years disappeared. The memory came without warning. Hospital monitors, white sheets, Linda, the final weeks, the helplessness. Watching someone you loved suffer, while knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it. Ethan lowered his head. The sensation passed, barely. When he looked up, Koda was watching him. Not the veterinarian, not the wound. Him, always him. The dog reached forward and rested his head against Ethan's arm. A simple gesture. Nothing dramatic. Yet somehow it broke something loose inside him. For months after losing Linda, Ethan had cried exactly once. Alone. In a truck stop restroom outside Spokane. 3 minutes, then never again. Now the tears came quietly, without warning, without resistance. One hand resting on Koda's neck, the other covering his eyes. No sobbing, no collapse. Just silent grief finally finding somewhere to go. Dr. Hart pretended not to notice. For that, Ethan would always be grateful. By midnight, they were back aboard the Northern Light. Koda had medication. Bandages, strict instructions to rest. The dog ignored the last part immediately. Instead of lying down in the berth, he positioned himself beside the hidden compartment, guarding it. Again, Ethan almost laughed. "You stubborn idiot." Koda's tail moved once. The storm outside strengthened overnight. Wind rattled the rigging. Rain hammered the wheelhouse windows. The northern light rocked harder against her lines. Ethan didn't sleep much, not because of PTSD this time, because he kept checking Koda. Every hour, sometimes every 30 minutes, the dog remained calm, breathing steadily, watching the cabin, watching the hatch, watching him. Near dawn, Ethan finally gave up on sleep. Coffee steamed beside the journals. The cabin lights cast warm, yellow pools across the table. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, he opened Raymond's third journal, the final volume. The last months before the fisherman vanished, the writing had become increasingly urgent. Every page tightened the noose around Martin Crow. More records, more evidence, more names. Then Ethan found something different. A folded note tucked between 2 pages. The paper looked newer than everything else, deliberately hidden. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he unfolded it. The handwriting belonged to Raymond, but the message wasn't a journal entry. It was a set of instructions, short, direct, almost military. If you're reading this, you've already found the truth. Ethan leaned forward. The cabin seemed smaller. The storm outside faded. There is one final safeguard. His eyes moved to the next line. The legal owner of the Northern Light becomes trustee of the Granger Harbor Fund. Ethan frowned. The Granger Harbor Fund. He had never seen the name before. The note continued. Documents are stored with Coastal Trust Bank in Aberdeen. Ownership of the vessel grants control. His heartbeat accelerated. A trust, a real trust. He read further. The final sentence stopped him cold. The fund exists to protect Gray Harbor after I'm gone. Beneath the note was an account reference number. Nothing more. No explanation. No amount. Just proof that the fund existed. Ethan sat motionless. Koda lifted his head from across the cabin, watching. The dog seemed to sense the shift. The discovery felt enormous. Not because of money, because of what it revealed about Raymond. The old fisherman hadn't simply exposed corruption. He had prepared for the future, prepared for years, built something designed to survive him. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the harbor. The cabin briefly filled with white light. Then darkness returned. Ethan picked up the note again, reading every word twice, 3 times. Then 4. A trust fund. Attached to the boat. Passed through ownership. Waiting. Just like the journals had waited. Just like the hidden compartment had waited. Just like Raymond had planned. The realization settled over him slowly. The fisherman hadn't hidden one secret. He had hidden several. And somehow, Koda had led him to every single one. The German shepherd rose carefully, despite the pain in his shoulder. He crossed the cabin, sat beside Ethan, and rested his head on the man's knee. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. The familiar gesture calmed them both. Outside, thunder rolled over the Pacific. Inside the Northern Light, Ethan looked down at the account number again. A trust, a safeguard, a final piece of Raymond's plan. And for the first time, he began to understand that the hidden documents were only half of the story. Whatever waited at Coastal Trust Bank might be even bigger. The storm arrived before sunrise. Not a normal coastal rainstorm. A real Pacific storm. The kind fishermen respected. The kind that changed plans, changed tides, changed lives. Wind howled across Gray Harbor. 30-foot fishing vessels strained against mooring lines. The harbor water turned black beneath rolling sheets of rain. The Northern Light rocked hard enough to shake dishes inside the galley. Koda stood at the wheelhouse window. His shoulder remained bandaged. The injury slowed him. It didn't stop him. Nothing ever seemed to. Ethan sipped coffee while studying weather reports on an old radio. Flood warnings, high surf advisories, coastal evacuation recommendations. The storm was growing stronger by the hour. Then the radio crackled. Harbor emergency meeting. All available boat owners requested at the marina. Ethan looked at Koda. The dog looked back. An hour later, he stood inside the harbor warehouse. Nearly 30 people had gathered. Fishermen, dock workers, business owners, volunteers. Martin Crow was nowhere in sight. County investigators had already begun reviewing harbor records, after anonymous reports reached state authorities several days earlier. Rumors spread quickly, questions spread faster. The storm temporarily pushed everything else aside. A sheriff's deputy pointed at a map. "We've got low-lying homes at risk." Several roads were already flooding. Power outages had begun. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Nobody seemed fully in charge. Nobody except Ethan. He didn't plan to speak, yet old instincts took over. The same instincts developed during emergency operations overseas. Assess, organize, act. He stepped forward. "We need sectors." The room quieted. People turned. Ethan pointed at the map. North waterfront, South marina, residential evacuation, medical transport. His voice remained calm, measured, confident. Not because he felt confident, because others needed someone who sounded that way. Within minutes, people were moving. Assignments, checkpoints, meeting locations. A local fisherman named Travis volunteered his boat. 2 younger dockhands took responsibility for road closures. The sheriff's deputy nodded, relieved someone was creating order. By noon, Gray Harbor was operating like a coordinated rescue effort. The storm worsened. Rain fell sideways. Tree branches littered roads. Power poles swayed. The ocean pounded the breakwater with explosive force. Through it all, Ethan kept moving, checking locations, helping elderly residents evacuate, transporting supplies, directing volunteers. Koda remained beside him, limping slightly, refusing to stay behind. At one flooded intersection, a fallen tree blocked access to several homes. Ethan climbed over debris with a chainsaw crew. Koda followed. The German shepherd's ears constantly scanned, watching, listening, working. The dog looked exhausted, yet he never slowed. Late that afternoon, Ethan finally returned to the northern light. Only briefly. The journals remained hidden. The documents remained locked away. The storm masked everything, including danger. The realization bothered him. He trusted the weather less than the men behind Raymond's disappearance. As he stepped onto the deck, Koda froze. Instantly, the dog stiffened, head turning toward the stern. A low growl emerged. Ethan stopped moving. The reaction was immediate, automatic. Every sense sharpened. The same feeling he'd experienced countless times before unexpected contact. He followed Koda's gaze. Nothing. Rain, darkness, shadows, then movement, a figure. Just for a second. Near the storage sheds beyond the dock. Gone almost immediately. Watching. Not hiding from the storm. Watching the boat. Watching them. Ethan's pulse slowed instead of accelerating. That always happened before trouble. The calm came first, then action. Koda growled again, a warning. The dog was never wrong. Ethan secured the journals inside the hidden compartment, then added a second layer of protection. Photographs, financial records, copies, everything. If someone got aboard again, they wouldn't find what they expected. The storm intensified after sunset. By evening, much of Gray Harbor had lost power. Only emergency generators remained. Darkness swallowed the waterfront. Around 9 p.m., Maggie's diner became an emergency shelter. Families gathered inside. Volunteers distributed blankets, coffee, soup, information. Ethan helped move supplies from trucks into the building. Koda rested near the entrance. For the first time all day, the dog appeared tired. Then the lights flickered, twice, 3 times, and went out. The room fell dark. A few people gasped. Children cried. Generators hummed somewhere behind the building. Flashlights appeared. Voices filled the darkness. Then Koda stood, immediately. Every hair along his back rose. Ethan saw it before he heard anything. The dog wasn't reacting to the storm. He was reacting to a person. A second later came the sound. A door opening. Not the front entrance, the rear storage entrance. Someone entering where they shouldn't. Koda moved before Ethan could. The German shepherd charged through the darkness. A bark exploded through the room. People turned. Flashlights swung. Then came shouting. A crash. Metal hitting concrete. Ethan sprinted toward the rear hallway. Years vanished. The movement felt familiar. Fast. Controlled. Purposeful. The emergency exit stood partially open. Rain blew inside. A shadow disappeared into the storm, running, fleeing, gone before anyone could identify him. Koda stood in the doorway, blocking it, protecting everyone inside. Ethan reached him, seconds later. The dog remained unharmed, this time. But something else caught Ethan's attention. A soaked backpack lay abandoned on the floor, dropped during the escape. The sheriff's deputy arrived moments later. He opened the pack. Inside were bolt cutters, gloves, flashlights, and something that made Ethan's stomach tighten. A photograph, not of Martin, not of Raymond. A photograph of the Northern Light, recently taken, with markings drawn around the lower hold access. Someone knew exactly what they were searching for. The room fell silent. Even above the storm, even above the generators, nobody spoke, because everyone understood. This wasn't random anymore. Someone was trying desperately to recover whatever Raymond Granger had hidden. The following morning, the storm finally began moving offshore. Gray skies remained, but the worst had passed, and so had any chance of keeping the secret buried. The county investigators arrived before noon. Reporters followed shortly after. Helen Granger stood beside Ethan on the harbor. The journals rested inside a waterproof case, ready. The evidence was complete. The attacks, the records, the photographs, the financial documents, everything. Raymond had spent years collecting proof. Now it was finally leaving the boat, finally leaving the darkness. As cameras began gathering near the marina, Ethan looked down at Koda. The dog sat beside him, bandaged, tired, still watching, still guarding, still refusing to quit. The truth that had waited nearly 10 years inside the Northern Light was finally about to reach shore. The first news van arrived shortly after noon. Then another, and another. By mid-afternoon, the quiet harbor Ethan had walked into with $10 and nowhere to go no longer felt quiet at all. Reporters stood near the docks. County investigators carried boxes of documents into temporary offices. Camera crews filmed the Northern Light from every angle. The rusted trawler that nobody wanted had become the center of Gray Harbor, and Raymond Granger's voice was finally being heard. Not through speeches, not through rumors, through evidence, facts, pages he had spent years protecting. Ethan hated attention. Most veterans he knew did. The cameras made him uncomfortable. The questions made him even more uncomfortable. So he stayed mostly aboard the Northern Light, working, cleaning, repairing, letting the documents speak for themselves. Koda remained close. The stitches were healing well. His shoulder still carried a patch of shaved fur, but the dog was moving easier now, stronger. Every morning he inspected the docks like a harbor security officer. Every evening he returned to Ethan's side. The two of them had fallen into a rhythm, a routine, something neither had enjoyed in a very long time. 3 days later, the county announced its findings. The evidence matched. Every major claim, every missing dollar, every falsified contract, every redirected relief fund. The records Raymond had hidden inside the boat proved accurate, painfully accurate. Martin Crowe was arrested that same afternoon. The news spread through town within minutes. Nobody celebrated. That surprised Ethan. He expected anger, shouting, vindication. Instead, there was mostly silence. The kind of silence that comes when a community realizes it has been betrayed by someone it trusted for decades. The harbor seemed quieter after that. Even the fishermen spoke softer, as if everyone was still processing the same question. How had they missed it? The answer arrived gradually, one story at a time. A woman named Clara Bennett came forward first. She visited Maggie's diner, carrying a faded envelope. Inside was an old cashier's check, 22 years earlier. Enough money to save her family's home after her father lost his job. They never knew who sent it. Now they did. Then came another family, and another, and another. The stories multiplied. A man whose fishing permit had been renewed anonymously after an injury. A widow whose property taxes had somehow been paid. A student whose college tuition had mysteriously appeared during her final year. A veteran whose rent had been covered while recovering from combat injuries. Every story led back to the same man. Raymond Granger. The fisherman everyone thought they knew. The fisherman nobody actually knew. One evening, Maggie pinned a photograph behind the diner counter. A simple picture. Raymond standing beside the northern light. Weathered face, sunburned skin. One hand resting on the rail. No smile. Just quiet contentment. Customers stopped and stared at it. Many for several minutes. Some cried. Most didn't. But almost everyone touched the frame before leaving. A silent thank you. A debt repaid too late. The memorial was held the following Saturday. The weather had finally cleared. Blue skies stretched across the harbor. The water reflected sunlight like polished glass. Nearly the entire town gathered near Slip 14. The northern light sat freshly cleaned behind them. Still rusted, still worn, but somehow different now. Alive. Helen Granger stood at a small wooden podium. A journal rested in her hands. The final journal. The last words her brother had written. Ethan stood near the back of the crowd. Koda beside him. The German shepherd sat quietly, despite the number of people surrounding him. Helen opened the journal. The harbor fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the gulls seemed distant. Then Helen began reading. Her voice carried across the water. Steady, clear, strong. She read Raymond's final entry, the one written before he disappeared. The one where he described sealing the evidence inside the northern light. The one where he wrote the words that had survived him. Steel does not forget. The sentence drifted over the harbor, then faded into silence. No applause followed, no cheering, nothing. Only waves touching the pilings. Only flags snapping gently in the wind. Only people standing quietly with their thoughts. The moment felt larger than words. Larger than justice, larger than punishment. It felt like a town finally seeing something it should have seen years ago. When the memorial ended, people slowly began leaving. One by one, family by family. The crowd dissolved. Eventually only a handful remained. Helen, Maggie, several fishermen, Ethan and Koda. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. Orange light spread across the harbor. Helen approached Ethan carrying something small, something wrapped in cloth. I found this among Raymond's things. She placed it in his hand. The object felt surprisingly heavy. Ethan unfolded the cloth. Inside rested an old brass key, worn smooth from decades of use. A small tag remained attached. Faded handwriting covered one side. For the finder, Ethan looked up. Helen smiled sadly. I think he meant you. The harbor seemed to stop moving. For a moment nobody spoke. The key glowed softly in the evening sunlight. Not large, not valuable, yet somehow important. Another piece of Raymond's plan. Another breadcrumb left behind. Another door waiting to be opened. What does it unlock? Ethan asked. Helen shook her head. I don't know. Then she looked toward the northern light. Toward the boat that had carried her brother's secrets for nearly a decade. Maybe that's the last thing he wanted someone to find. Ethan closed his fingers around the key. The metal felt warm. For the first time since buying the trawler, he sensed the end of the journey approaching. Not the end of Raymond's story, the end of the mystery. The final piece was still missing. And somehow, after everything that had happened, Raymond Granger had already left the path forward. One last key, one last secret, waiting patiently for the right person to turn the lock. The key sat on the table inside the northern light all night. Beside Raymond's journals, beside an empty coffee cup, beside a sleeping German shepherd whose bandaged shoulder rose and fell with every breath. Ethan stared at it long after darkness settled over Gray Harbor. The brass was worn smooth, not from years in a drawer, from use. Someone had carried it often, maybe every day. By midnight, he still hadn't tried it. Some things deserved patience, some things deserved respect. The next morning, Helen arrived carrying a cardboard box. Inside were several personal items recovered from Raymond's old storage locker after county. Officials finally released it. Photographs, fishing licenses, old logbooks, a rusted compass, nothing remarkable, until Koda stood. The dog moved directly toward the box, nose working, tail slowly swaying. Then he stopped, one paw lifted, a signal Ethan had learned years ago. There, something mattered there. Helen carefully removed a stack of papers. Underneath sat an old metal lockbox, dark green, military surplus, small enough to fit beneath one arm. A single brass lock secured the front, the same size as the key. The cabin suddenly became very quiet. Helen looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the key. Neither spoke. Koda sat beside the box, watching, waiting, as if he already knew. Ethan picked up the brass key. The metal felt warm from sunlight, streaming through the wheelhouse windows. Slowly he inserted it into the lock. A soft click, nothing dramatic, no hidden treasure, no fortune, just a simple sound, the sound of a door finally opening. Inside were dozens of envelopes, bundles of photographs, handwritten letters tied with twine, and one larger envelope resting on top. The handwriting was familiar. To whoever finds the truth. Ethan opened it carefully. The paper crackled softly. Raymond's words filled the page. If you're reading this, then you cared enough to keep going. That means more than anything I could leave behind. The money is not the important part. The boat is not the important part. The truth is not even the important part. People are, always people. Help them if you can. That is all that matters. The letter continued for several pages, simple observations, lessons learned, regrets, memories, nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just wisdom earned through a lifetime. Then Ethan reached the final page and stopped reading. His eyes remained fixed on a single paragraph. For a long moment he didn't move. Helen noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ethan swallowed. "Then read the passage aloud. In 2016, I made a contribution through the Northwest Veterans Medical Assistance Program. The recipient's name was withheld from me. A former Army staff sergeant whose wife was undergoing cancer treatment. I never knew the family. I only knew they needed help. The cabin seemed to shrink around him. The sunlight, the harbor, the sound of gulls, everything faded. The words remained. A former Army staff sergeant. Cancer treatment. The year Linda became sick. The year everything started falling apart. The year the medical bills began arriving faster than he could pay them. The year one anonymous grant had suddenly appeared. A grant large enough to pay for an experimental treatment. A treatment that gave Linda 6 more months. 6 more months of birthdays, conversations, sunsets. 6 more months together. At the time, Ethan never learned who funded it. Nobody ever told him. Now he knew. The room blurred slightly. Not from age, not from exhaustion, from something else. Helen covered her mouth. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Raymond Granger, a man Ethan had never met. A man who died years before they crossed paths. Had already changed his life long before the Northern Light entered it. Long before Gray Harbor. Long before the $10 auction. Koda slowly crossed the cabin. The dog rested his head against Ethan's knee, exactly as he had done in the veterinary clinic, exactly as he always did, grounding him, bringing him back. Ethan smiled through wet eyes. For the first time, the entire journey made sense. Not the mystery, not the investigation, something deeper, a connection stretching across years. One quiet act of kindness leading to another, and another and another. 6 months later, Gray Harbor looked different. The Northern Light gleamed beneath fresh paint. The engine ran smoothly. The harbor repairs funded by the Granger Trust were underway. New pilings lined the docks. Fishing families received emergency assistance. Scholarships had been awarded. Veterans facing hardship received support. The work continued. Exactly as Raymond intended. Ethan became trustee of the Granger Foundation, not because he wanted power, because he understood responsibility. Several younger veterans worked alongside him now, helping with rescue training. emergency response, community projects, teaching the same lessons service had taught him. Koda became something of a local legend. Children greeted him by name. Tourists asked for photographs. Fishermen slipped him treats when Ethan wasn't looking. His scar remained visible beneath his fur. A reminder, proof of loyalty, proof of sacrifice. One evening, near sunset, Ethan stood on the deck of the Northern Light. The harbor glowed gold beneath the fading light. Fishing boats returned through the channel. Seagulls drifted overhead. The smell of salt and diesel floated on the breeze. Koda lay beside him, content, peaceful, home. For a long time neither moved. The harbor was alive. The trust was helping people. The future no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something worth building. Ethan looked toward the horizon, toward the water Raymond had loved, toward the town he had quietly protected for decades. Then he looked down at Koda. The dog opened one eye, as if checking that everything was still okay. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, buddy." His voice was barely above a whisper. "We made it." The sun slipped lower. The Northern Light rocked gently against her lines. The same boat everyone had called cursed. The same boat nobody wanted. The same boat that had carried secrets, truth, kindness, and second chances through nearly a decade of silence. And standing there with the dog who had found it all, Ethan finally understood something Raymond Granger had known for most of his life. The people the world notices least are often the ones quietly holding everything together. The harbor lights came on one by one. The water settled. Night arrived. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Walker wasn't looking for the next place to go. He was already home. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Comment a simple one below if you believe people like Raymond Granger still exist in this world, quietly helping others without asking for recognition. Or comment a 0 if you think true kindness has become rare. I read as many comments as I can, and I always enjoy seeing where our community stands. And if you enjoyed Ethan and Koda's journey, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. There are many more powerful stories waiting ahead. Stories of loyalty, sacrifice, second chances, and the extraordinary things ordinary people can do. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and never underestimate the difference one person can make. We'll see you in the next story.